What the last thing someone said to you before disappearing forever was, "We'll meet on a line between worlds"? What would go through your mind? Would you try to decipher every word, searching for clues about where that person went? Or would you be paralyzed by the weight of such an enigmatic message, so laden with hidden meaning that it seems to point to something beyond our comprehension? And more importantly, would you have the courage to follow that line wherever it may be to find them? This isn't a hypothetical question. This really happened. Someone left exactly this message and then simply disappeared, leaving behind a shattered family, confused friends, and investigators desperately trying to understand what those words really meant. Because when a person's last communication is a phrase that sounds like mystical poetry, how do you turn that into a concrete investigative clue? How do you find someone when the only direction they've given you is the line between worlds? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you in ways you can't even imagine. We're talking about a case that challenges not only our understanding of disappearances, but forces us to question the boundaries between the literal and the metaphorical, between the physical and the spiritual, between this world and whatever exists beyond it. And the journey to try and understand this message will take us down paths that are both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Think about it. When someone is about to leave wherever they're going and chooses to leave a final message, every word matters. Every word is laden with intention, with meaning, with something that person considered important enough to be their last known words. So when those words speak of encounters across lines between worlds, we can't simply dismiss them as meaningless poetic speech. It had to mean something. But what? Have you ever experienced that moment when someone said something to you that only made sense much later? Those words that seemed casual or strange at the time, but in retrospect revealed a depth you hadn't realized? Multiply that feeling by 1,000. Add the despair of a missing person, and you begin to understand the torment of the person who received that message. Because it wasn't just about understanding the words. It was about following the words wherever they led, in the desperate hope that they might lead to the person who wrote them. The line between worlds. What line is that? Does it physically exist somewhere? Is it a metaphor for the border between life and death? That threshold we will all eventually cross, but from which no one returns to tell the tale? Or is it something more esoteric, more related to parallel dimensions, alternative realities, planes of existence that science cannot yet explain, but that philosophies and religions around the world have recognized for millennia? The possibilities are endless, and each one leads the investigation down a completely different path. And here's what's most chilling. This message wasn't left by someone in a state of mental confusion. It wasn't written during a psychotic episode. It wasn't the product of a mind that had lost touch with reality. It was left by someone lucid, functional, who apparently knew exactly what they were saying and to whom they were saying it, which makes it all the more mysterious, because it means there was clarity of purpose. There was deliberate intention behind those specific words. When you hear "we'll meet again," there's an implicit promise there. It's not goodbye forever. It's see you later in a specific place. And that place, that line between worlds, was real enough in the mind of the writer to be offered as a future meeting point. This suggests that the person genuinely believed in the existence of that place, or at least in the possibility of reaching it. And if you believe you can get somewhere, you can try to go there. The question is, did they try? And if they tried, did they succeed? The impact of this message goes far beyond the words themselves, because it completely transforms the nature of disappearance. It's no longer just someone who vanished without explanation. It's someone who left a map, even if that map is written in a language most of us can't read. It's someone who, in their last moments of communication with this world, chose to speak about other worlds, about lines that separate realities, about encounters that will happen in places that may not even exist on the physical plane we all share. And for those left behind, for those who received this message and now have to live with it constantly echoing in their minds, the question that never goes away is, should I have understood? Was there a way to decipher this in time? What if I had paid more attention, asked the right questions? Maybe I could have prevented what happened. Or maybe, just maybe, I could have followed that mysterious line and brought the person back before it was too late. But to fully understand the weight of this message, to truly feel the impact of these enigmatic words, we first need to know who wrote them. Because behind every mystery, there's a real person, a real life, a story that deserves to be told, all the care and respect we can offer. Before we delve into the story of the person behind this enigmatic message, I need to ask you something that will make all the difference if this topic resonates with you. If you're also intrigued by messages that seem to carry meanings far beyond the words, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. Have you ever received a message that only made sense later? Have you ever had that feeling that someone was trying to tell you something important, but using language you couldn't fully decipher? Share it here, because every experience you bring enriches this community and helps us better understand how enigmatic messages work and why they affect us so deeply. And look, if you're feeling that chill down your spine, that insatiable curiosity about where the story is going, leave a like on this video. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. Each like shows that it's worth investing time and care in exploring cases that go beyond the superficial, that deal with real human mysteries with the seriousness and respect they deserve. That's how we can continue bringing you stories that make you think, that make you question, that make you see the world in a slightly different way. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, now is the perfect time. Click that subscribe button and activate the bell, because here we don't just bring you sensationalist cases. We delve into the deepest layers of real mysteries, exploring not only what happened, but why, how, and what it reveals about our human nature. You're not just a spectator here. You're part of this investigative journey as much as I am. We are a community of people who aren't satisfied with easy answers, who want to understand the most complex and disturbing mysteries that reality presents us with. Now, with you by my side in this investigation, let's find out who the person was who left such an enigmatic message. Because to understand the words, we first need to understand the mind and heart of the person who wrote them. Now I want to delve even deeper into the subject, because the person behind this enigmatic message wasn't a fictional character, wasn't someone living on the fringes of society without connections or purpose. It was someone exactly like you or me, with a completely normal life until it wasn't. And it's precisely this normality that makes everything even more disturbing, because it shows that any one of us, under certain circumstances, can reach a point where words about lines between worlds make more sense than the everyday reality we all share. His name was Lucas Andrade, and he was 33 years old when he disappeared. To those who knew him, Lucas was the kind of person you always want to have around. Not necessarily the most extroverted person in the room, but definitely the most genuine. He worked as an architect in a mid-sized firm in the capital, and those who worked with him describe him as a meticulous, creative professional who took his projects seriously but never lost his sense of humor, even when deadlines were tight. Lucas had that rare talent for transforming spaces into something more than just functional structures. He created environments that had soul, that made people feel at home, even in commercial buildings. In his personal life, Lucas lived alone in a small but carefully decorated apartment in the city center. Every object there had a story. Every piece of furniture had been chosen with care, and visitors always commented on how the space perfectly reflected his personality. Minimalist yet welcoming, organized yet creative, modern yet with touches of nostalgia. On the shelves, you would find an eclectic mix of books on architecture, philosophy, science fiction, and poetry. Lucas was one of those people who read everything, who believed that knowledge has no boundaries and that every area of human thought had something valuable to offer. He had a small but extremely close circle of friends. He wasn't one to maintain hundreds of superficial contacts. He preferred to cultivate a few deep friendships. His friends from college say that Lucas was the kind of person who truly listened when you spoke, who remembered details about your life weeks later, who would show up with a book he had read and thought you would enjoy. He was that constant and reliable presence that makes you feel less alone in the world. Lucas's family was small. His mother, Mariana, and a younger sister, Sophia, 28 years old. His father had passed away when Lucas was a teenager, and since then he had assumed a kind of emotional provider role for the family. Even without ever being asked, he visited his mother every week, without fail, usually on Sundays for lunch. It was a ritual that Mariana adored, those hours where they could talk about everything and nothing, where Lucas told her about the projects he was developing and she shared stories about the neighbors and her routine. With Sophia, the relationship was one of complicity typical of close siblings, that mixture of protection and teasing that only those who have siblings understand. On weekends, Lucas had his rituals. Saturday mornings were sacred for running in the park, not out of obsession with fitness, but because he said that's when his mind was clearest, when the best project ideas appear out of nowhere during those kilometers of repetitive movement. After his run, he invariably stopped at the same bakery for coffee and to read the newspaper, always sitting at the same corner table that offered the best natural light. It was a simple routine, but one that brought him comfort and stability. Lucas also had a lesser-known passion, amateur astronomy. He had a modest telescope installed on his apartment balcony, and on clear nights he would spend hours observing stars, planets, and constellations. He kept a diary where he recorded his observations, made drawings of what he saw, and wrote reflections on the immensity of the universe and humanity's place in it. This interest in the cosmos, in the mysteries of space, was something few knew about him. It wasn't a secret, just something he didn't share widely. But those who leafed through that diary after his disappearance found pages and pages of profound questions about existence, about whether there's life beyond Earth, about multiple dimensions, about the nature of reality. In terms of romance, Lucas had had a few relationships over the years, nothing that had turned into a long-term commitment, but also nothing traumatic or problematic. He was selective, preferred to be alone than with the wrong person, and his friends joked that he had too high standards. Lucas laughed and said that they weren't high standards. It was just that he knew what he wanted, and it didn't make sense to force connections that weren't genuine. In the months leading up to his disappearance, he was single and, according to all accounts, completely at peace with it. The subtle transformation in Lucas's personality began about 6 months before he disappeared, but it was so gradual that no one noticed it as anything worrying at the time. He started talking more about philosophical concepts, about the nature of consciousness, about theories of multiple universes. In casual conversations, he would make comments about how the reality we perceive might be just one layer of something much larger. His friends found it interesting, even intellectually stimulating. No one saw it as a warning sign, because Lucas had always been thoughtful, always questioning, always philosophical. He also began attending lectures and discussion groups on quantum physics, scientific spirituality, and philosophy of mind. It wasn't anything cult-like. They were academic or semi-academic events, the kind of thing curious and educated people do to broaden their horizons. But what nobody knew was that Lucas was making connections between all these ideas, developing his own worldview that synthesized science, philosophy, and spiritual elements in a way that made perfect sense to him but would be difficult to explain to others. Professionally, Lucas remained exemplary. His projects were delivered on time. The quality hadn't diminished. He attended meetings and participated normally. But some colleagues noticed that he seemed more distracted, more introspective. Sometimes he would stare out the window for long minutes, clearly lost in deep thought. When asked if everything was all right, he would smile and say yes, that he was just reflecting on a project. And technically he wasn't lying. He just didn't mention that the project he was reflecting on wasn't architectural, it was existential. Mrs. Mariana also noticed changes, but in a different way. She says that in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, Lucas seemed more present during Sunday lunches, more attentive, more affectionate, as if he were trying to absorb every moment. She thought it was beautiful at the time, believing her son was finally learning to appreciate the little things. Only later did she realize that perhaps he was saying goodbye, savoring those moments because he knew they would be his last. Sophia noticed that Lucas had started asking strange questions. Things like, what do you think exists after death? Or, have you ever felt that there's more to reality than we can perceive? She answered casually, thinking they were just late-night philosophical conversations, the kind of things siblings discuss when they're in the mood to daydream. She never imagined he was processing profound decisions, that he was preparing for something that would change everything. Lucas's mindset in those final months, reconstructed through diaries, notes, and remembered conversations, reveals someone on an intense intellectual and spiritual journey. He was genuinely questioning the nature of existence, seeking to understand if there were forms of consciousness or reality beyond what we experience in our daily lives. And somehow, through readings, reflections, and perhaps experiences he never fully shared, he arrived at conclusions that led him to make decisions that no one around him could have foreseen. Lucas wasn't crazy. He wasn't in a psychotic crisis. He hadn't lost touch with reality in any clinical sense, but he was operating with an understanding of reality that had expanded beyond conventional, and this put him on a path that would eventually lead him to leave that enigmatic message and disappear without anyone being able to stop him or even fully understand why. Comment below. Lucas was real. If you feel that knowing the person behind the mystery makes everything more impactful and human. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when we look at the days and weeks leading up to Lucas's disappearance with the knowledge of what was to come, the signs were all there. They weren't obvious. They weren't alarming enough to make someone call the police or force an intervention, but they were present in every conversation, in every decision, in every small gesture that only made complete sense after he left that enigmatic message and simply disappeared. Let's begin exactly 3 weeks before the disappearance. It was a Saturday, and Lucas did something completely out of the ordinary for him. He called all his close friends one by one and suggested they get together. It wasn't anyone's birthday, it wasn't any special occasion, but he insisted he wanted to get everyone together. They arranged to have dinner that same evening at a restaurant Lucas chose, a place overlooking the city where they could watch the lights come on as the sun set. During dinner, Lucas was strangely contemplative, but at the same time present in a way his friends hadn't seen him in a long time. One of his friends, Raphael, remembers that Lucas insisted on making a toast. He raised his glass and said something that at the time seemed merely poetic, but now carries a sinister weight. To the journey each of us is making, and to the paths we will eventually have to tread alone, even when our hearts want to remain together. Everyone thought it was beautiful, perhaps a little melancholic, but beautiful. They toasted, laughed, and continued the night. No one noticed that Lucas was saying goodbye. During that dinner, Lucas also did something peculiar. He asked for a group photo, and then insisted on taking individual photos with each person. He hugged each friend, looked directly into their eyes for a moment that was almost uncomfortable in its intensity, and then smiled and asked for the photo. Later, when investigators analyzed these photos, they realized that in each one, Lucas had an expression that mixed joy with something that seemed like anticipated longing, as if he were already missing people who were still there, present. 2 weeks before his disappearance, Lucas visited his mother on a day that wasn't a Sunday. Donna Mariana was surprised but happy to see him. He helped her with some repairs around the house, small things she had mentioned needing to do but always postponed. Lucas spent the whole day there, fixing faucets, changing light bulbs, organizing the garage cupboard. It was simple manual work, but he did everything with an almost ritualistic care, as if each task was important, as if he were leaving his mother's house in perfect condition before embarking on a long trip. At the end of that day, Lucas sat with Donna Mariana on the sofa, and they talked for hours. She remembers him asking questions about his father, about their marriage, about how his mother had dealt with his death years before. He asked about her beliefs, about what she thought happened after death, about whether she believed in reunions in other planes of existence. Donna Mariana answered sincerely, sharing her personal beliefs that mixed Catholicism with spiritualism, and Lucas listened to every word with deep attention. Before leaving, he hugged his mother for an unusually long time and said, "Thank you for everything, Mom, for all the life you gave me." She found it strange at the time, but thought he was just being sentimental. With Sophia, the transformation in their interactions was different. Lucas started sending more frequent messages, random things throughout the day, photos of places he passed by with captions like, "This reminded me of you," or "You would like it here." He also started transferring money to her account without explanation, small amounts that he said were just because, or for you to treat yourself. Sophia accepted with gratitude but also with confusion, because Lucas had never been like this before. He had always been generous, but this seemed different, almost as if he were distributing his resources, putting his things in order. At work, Lucas began delivering projects unusually far ahead of schedule, things that didn't need to be ready for weeks. He would finish and deliver. He also created excessively detailed documentation for each ongoing project, manuals explaining every design decision, every material choice, as if he were ensuring that anyone could take over his projects without him. His colleagues thought he was just being exceptionally professional, but in retrospect, it was clearly someone preparing to no longer be around. 10 days before his disappearance, Lucas did something no one knew until later. He went to the notary's office and updated his will. He left clear instructions on how his assets should be divided between his mother and sister. He also left sealed letters for each of them, with instructions that they should only be opened if he disappeared or died. These letters were only discovered weeks later, when the family gained access to his documents. And the content of the letters, which we will explore further, revealed that Lucas knew exactly what he was planning to do. A week prior, Lucas canceled several subscriptions and services. Netflix, Spotify, his gym membership, everything was canceled. He also donated most of his clothes and books to charities, keeping only the essentials. When friends asked about it, he said he was decluttering, adopting a more minimalist lifestyle. No one questioned why it made sense given his personality, but the timing and extent of the decluttering were clear signs that he was letting go of material ties to this life. 5 days before his disappearance, Lucas had a conversation with Raphael that only made complete sense afterward. They were having coffee, and Lucas asked, "Do you believe there are choices in life that are so fundamentally transformative that there's no going back after making them?" Raphael responded philosophically, talking about marriage, career, children. But Lucas shook his head and said, "No, that's not it. I'm talking about decisions that change not only your life, but your very existence. Decisions that take you beyond what you know is reality." Raphael laughed and made a joke about drugs, but Lucas became serious and said, "It's not about drugs. It's about recognizing that there are doors we can walk through if we have enough courage. Doors that lead to places most people can't even conceive of." 3 days earlier, Lucas had spent the entire day with Sophia. They went to the movies, then walked to the park, talked about childhood memories, about the father they had lost, about plans for the future. Sophia noticed that Lucas asked her many questions about how she was doing, if she felt happy, if she had what she needed in life. He also made a point of repeatedly telling her how much he loved her, how proud he was of the person she had become. At the end of the day, he gave her an envelope and asked her to keep it in a safe place, but only open it if something happened to him. Sophia laughed nervously and asked what could happen, but Lucas simply said, "You never know. Just promise me you'll keep it safe." She promised, without imagining that she would only open that envelope days later. On the penultimate day, Lucas took the day off work. He spent the morning on the balcony with his telescope. Even though it was a clear day and there was nothing to observe in the daytime sky, neighbors who saw him said he stayed there for hours, just looking up at the infinite blue sky, as if he were saying goodbye to the stars he loved to observe so much. In the afternoon, he walked around the city, visiting places that had meaning for him. The bakery where he had coffee on Saturdays, the park where he ran, the bookstore where he spent hours browsing books. In each place, he stopped, observed, seemingly absorbing every detail as if he wanted to carry those memories with him wherever he was going. And then came Lucas's last known day. He woke up early, went through his usual morning routine, but with an almost supernatural calm. He posted a photo on Instagram of the sunrise seen from his balcony with an enigmatic caption. "Some journeys begin where others end. Some doors only open when you're ready to leave everything behind." Several people liked and commented, most interpreting it as a philosophical morning reflection. No one imagined it was a literal announcement of intentions. Comment below, the signs were there if you realize in retrospect that silent goodbyes were happening all along. Now I want to delve even deeper into the subject, because we've reached a crucial moment, the point where the silent farewells and subtle signs culminated in that message that would change everything. And the way Lucas left those words, "We'll meet on the line between worlds," wasn't accidental. It wasn't improvised. It was carefully planned, specifically directed at the people he knew most needed to hear them, even if they couldn't fully understand them at the time. The message was left in 3 different ways, each addressed to a specific person in Lucas's life, and each with slightly different nuances that reveal how much he thought about how his words would be received. Let's start with the first discovery, which happened the morning after his disappearance. Sophia woke up and saw that she had a voice message on WhatsApp sent by Lucas at 3:42 in the morning. She hadn't heard the phone because she was sleeping with silent mode activated, something she would deeply regret later. When Sophia finally listened to the message a few hours later, she wasn't prepared for what she would hear. Lucas's voice sounded calm, almost serene, but laden with emotion she couldn't quite identify. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't fear. It was something closer to reverent expectation, like someone about to embark on an important journey they had been planning for a long time. He said, "Sophia, if you're listening to this, it means I've already begun my journey. Don't look for me in the places you know, because I won't be there. I've crossed over to where I need to be. But don't worry, it's not a permanent goodbye. We'll meet at the border between worlds, when it's your time to understand what that means. I love you more than words can express. Take care of your mother, and remember that true love transcends all dimensions." Sophia listened to the message 3 times before processing what she was hearing. Her first thought was that perhaps it was an elaborate prank, or maybe Lucas was having some kind of breakdown. She tried to call back immediately, but his phone was either switched off or out of service. She sent desperate messages that were only checked, never delivered. It was only after the entire day had passed without any contact that panic truly set in, and she called her mother, her friends, and eventually the police. The second manifestation of the message was found by Mrs. Mariana. Remember those sealed envelopes Lucas had left with instructions to open them if something happened to him? When it became clear that Lucas had disappeared, Mrs. Mariana opened the envelope addressed to her with trembling hands. Inside was a handwritten letter, in Lucas's careful handwriting that she had known since he was a child learning to write. The letter had several pages, each expressing deep gratitude for everything she had done for him, specific childhood memories, words of love and appreciation that made Mrs. Mariana cry even before reaching the final part. And on the last page of the letter, Lucas wrote, "Mom, when you read this, I will have already departed on a journey that I cannot explain in a way that makes complete sense to you right now. But I need you to know that it is not suicide. It is not despair. It is not abandonment. It is transformation. It is following a path that has revealed itself to me and that I cannot ignore. You have always taught me to be courageous, to seek truths even when they are difficult to accept. I am doing exactly that. We will meet on the line between worlds, in that place where love continues to exist beyond physical limitations. Until then, live fully, be happy, and know that I am at peace with my decision." Donna Mariana read and reread that letter countless times, trying to find clues about where Lucas might have gone, try to decipher what he really meant. The mindset of a mother who loses a child, even temporarily through disappearance, oscillates between denial and painful acceptance. She wanted to believe there was a rational explanation, that Lucas was somewhere and would return when he was ready. But his words suggested something more final, something that didn't allow for a simple return. The third version of the message was found in Lucas's apartment when the police finally obtained authorization to enter and conduct a search. On his bedroom wall, written in large, careful letters with black permanent marker, was a complete phrase: "We will meet on the line between worlds." But there was more. Around the main phrase in smaller letters, Lucas had written what appeared to be coordinates, not geographical ones, but something more abstract, sequences of numbers that did not correspond to known latitude and longitude, symbols that mixed mathematical notation with elements that seemed esoteric. Investigators took extensive photographs of the wall, brought in experts to try to decipher what those numbers and symbols could mean. Some thought they were codes, others thought they might be dates or times. Some even suggested they were radio frequencies or coordinates in alternative reference systems. But to this day, no one has reached a consensus on what those annotations around the central phrase really represented. It was as if Lucas had left a map, but map written in a language that only he fully understood. The emotional impact of these messages on the people who received them was devastating in different but equally profound ways. For Sophia, hearing her brother's voice calmly explaining that he was leaving for somewhere beyond the known was a particular form of torture, because it wasn't a message of despair that she could try to prevent. It was a decision already made, already executed, communicated only as a fait accompli. The helplessness of knowing that when she woke up and heard that message, Lucas had already been missing for hours, had already crossed whatever line he believed existed, created a kind of guilt that is almost impossible to process. For Donna Mariana, the letter represented both farewell and promise. Farewell to this life, to this world, but promise a reunion in some undefined place called a line between worlds. As a mother, she wanted to believe in the promise. She wanted to believe she would see her son again. But her rational side fought against accepting a premise that seemed more fantasy than reality. And this tension between wanting to believe and not being able to completely believe created a constant anguish that was never resolved. When Lucas's friends learned the content of the messages, they reacted with a mixture of shock and attempts at rationalization. Some insisted there had to be a logical explanation, that perhaps Lucas was going through a psychotic episode that led him to create an elaborate narrative about other dimensions. Others, knowing Lucas's philosophical and intellectual nature, considered the possibility that he genuinely believed he had discovered some truth about the nature of reality that led him to make the most radical decision possible. Raphael, in particular, was tormented by the conversation he'd had with Lucas days before about transformative decisions that changed not only life but existence itself. In retrospect, Lucas was clearly talking about what he planned to do, testing the waters, perhaps seeking validation or at least understanding. Raphael constantly wondered if he should have realized it, if he should have asked more questions, if he could have prevented what happened. But the reality is that when someone is determined to follow a path and deeply believes in the rightness of that decision, little can be done to dissuade them through external arguments. The phrase itself, "we shall meet on the line between worlds," became the object of obsessive analysis. Linguists were consulted. Philosophers offered interpretations. Even theoretical physicists were questioned about what line between worlds could mean in the context of multiple universes theory. Each expert offered different perspectives, but no explanation seemed to fully capture what Lucas meant, because in the end, these were his words, laden with meanings he had constructed through his particular intellectual and spiritual journey, and without full access to that journey, any interpretation would necessarily be partial. What made the message even more impactful was its promise-like nature. It wasn't goodbye. It was a see you later. It wasn't we'll never see each other again. It was we'll meet in a specific place. This kept the door open, a hope that was both comforting and agonizing, because it meant that Lucas didn't see his departure as an absolute end, but as a journey to something different where connections could be maintained. But this hope came with the practical impossibility of verification, of knowing if the promised reunion was real or just a metaphorical construct to soften the pain of separation. Write this down. Words last forever. If you understand how a final message can resonate endlessly in the lives of those left behind. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because after learning about the messages Luke left behind, the question that dominates the minds of everyone involved is, what exactly did he mean by the line between the worlds? And when you begin to explore the multiple layers of possible meaning, when you consult experts from different fields, when you examine cultural and religious references throughout human history, what emerges is a concept so rich and multifaceted that it can mean almost anything, depending on perspective of the interpreter. Let's begin with the most literal and perhaps most painful interpretation: the line between worlds as a metaphor for the boundary between life and death. In this reading, Luke would be saying that they would meet in the afterlife, whatever that means in terms of the continuity of consciousness after physical death. This interpretation gains strength when we consider that in practically all human cultures there is some concept of threshold or boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The ancient Greeks spoke of the river Styx that separated the realm of the living from Hades. African traditions speak of crossroads where worlds meet. Tibetan Buddhism describes a bardo, an intermediate state between death and rebirth. Dr. Enrique Costa, a philosopher specializing in studies on death and mortality, analyzed Lucas's phrase from this perspective. He explains that the choice of the words line between instead of simply another world is significant. A line suggests something thin, delicate, a boundary that can be crossed but separates distinct territories. And the plural worlds implies that it is not a simple binary opposition between this world and the next, but multiple planes of existence with this line serving as an interface or point of connection between them all. But there is an alternative interpretation that comes from theoretical physics, and that some researchers have seriously considered. In the theory of multiple universes or multiverse, there is the idea that parallel realities can exist simultaneously, separated by dimensions that we do not normally access. The line between worlds could, in this reading, refer to some kind of dimensional boundary. Dr. Paulo Mendez, a physicist consultant on the case, admits that although this sounds like science fiction, there are legitimate mathematical models that describe the possibility of multiple coexisting realities. Lucas had shown a growing interest in quantum physics in the months before he disappeared. His browsing history showed that he had read extensively about the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, about string theory which posits additional dimensions beyond those we perceive, about concepts of dimensional membranes that could theoretically intersect. For a mind like Lucas's, trained in spatial thinking through architecture, but also philosophically inclined, these scientific concepts could emerge with spiritual ideas, creating a unique worldview where a line between worlds had a very specific and literal meaning. Linguistics experts analyzed the sentence structure, looking for nuances that could reveal intention. Dr. Beatriz Almeida, a forensic linguist, pointed out that the use of the future tense, we will meet, instead of the conditional we could meet, demonstrates absolute certainty, not tentative hope. Lucas was not expressing desire or possibility. He was declaring inevitability. And the choice of we will meet instead of meet is equally revealing because it positions a reunion as something that will happen naturally over time, not as something that requires active searching on their part. Esoteric and mystical traditions offer further interpretations. In Western occultism, particularly in Hermetic traditions, there is a concept of a veil between worlds, which refers to a perceptual barrier between the material plane and astral or spiritual planes. Practitioners of certain traditions believe that this veil can be crossed through specific practices of meditation, astral projection, or altered states of consciousness. Maria Santos, a researcher of esoteric traditions, suggested that Lucas may have studied these practices and believed he had developed the ability to consciously cross this threshold. Investigators found several books on astral projection, consciousness travel, and out-of-body experiences in Lucas's apartment. There were notes in the margins where Lucas questioned, reflected on, and apparently experimented with the techniques described. One of his notebooks contained records of what he called approaches to the line, moments during deep meditations where he felt he was approaching some kind of perceptual threshold that, if crossed, would take him beyond everyday reality. The mindset that Lucas developed seems to have been a unique synthesis of multiple traditions. He wasn't a rigid adherent of any specific philosophy or religion, but rather took elements from various and constructed his own framework for understanding. From Buddhists, he absorbed ideas about the illusory nature of perceived reality. From quantum physicists, he took concepts about multiple coexisting realities. From mystics, he adopted practices for altering states of consciousness. And from his own intuition and experiences, he synthesized all of this into a personal belief that there were literally other accessible worlds, and that it found, or was about to find, his way to them. There is also a more psychological interpretation that some experts have proposed. Psychologists specializing in suicidal ideation have noted that sometimes people develop elaborate and metaphorical narratives as a way of processing extreme decisions. Line between worlds could be a mental construct that Lucas created to give meaning and purpose to what he planned to do. In this reading, it wouldn't be about literally believing in alternative dimensions, but about creating a framework that would make his decision understandable to himself and, hopefully, eventually to those he would leave behind. But Lucas's family and close friends strongly reject this interpretation. They insist that Lucas was not in despair, showed no signs of clinical depression, and was not running away from unsolvable problems. On the contrary, he seemed to be at peace, even excited about what he believed he was about to discover or experience. This makes the purely psychological interpretation less satisfactory because it does not capture the positive seeking nature that seemed to motivate Lucas instead of the negative escape from suffering. Interestingly, when researchers searched for historical precedents of people using similar language before disappearing, they found a few scattered but disturbingly similar cases. In 1976, a philosophy professor in California left a note before disappearing that read, "I crossed the threshold to the other side of consciousness." He was never found. In 2003, an artist in France disappeared after painting a series of pictures depicting what she called boundaries between realities. She was also never located. These cases suggest that there may be a broader phenomenon of people who develop beliefs about the accessibility of other dimensions or states of existence and act on those beliefs in ways that result in permanent disappearances. The impact of all these possible interpretations is that no one can be certain what Lucas truly meant, And perhaps this ambiguity was intentional. Perhaps he knew that different people would interpret it differently, and each would find a version of truth they could live with. For Donna Mariana, who has religious faith, line between worlds could mean heaven or a spiritual plane where they will meet again after her death. For Sophia, more secular, it could be a metaphor for memory and legacy, the way people continue to live in our consciousness after physically departing. For friends interested in science, it could be a poetic reference to concepts in advanced physics. The journey to decipher these words also revealed something profound about human nature, our desperate need for things to make sense, especially when they involve loss. Every theory, every interpretation, every analysis is an attempt to impose order and meaning on something that may, fundamentally, be incomprehensible to those who have not undergone the specific mental and spiritual transformation that Lucas did. And perhaps the hidden truth is that the line between worlds existed in Lucas's consciousness as real as any physical place exists for us. And questioning its objective reality is less important than accepting that for him, it was real enough to guide the most important decision of his life. Comment below. Everyone sees it differently. If you realize how the same phrase can contain multiple truths depending on the perspective of the person interpreting it. Now I want to delve even deeper into the subject, because after exploring all the possible meanings of Lucas's enigmatic message, we've reached a point where we need to confront the theories about what really happened to him. And each theory leads an investigation down radically different paths, each with evidence that seems convincing until you consider the contradictions. Let's examine the main hypotheses with the respect and seriousness that this case deserves, because behind each theory there is a family seeking answers and a real person whose fate remains unknown. The first and most painful theory is that Lucas committed suicide, and that the message about finding himself on a line between worlds was a poetic and metaphorical way of saying goodbye while maintaining some comforting hope for those who remained. This hypothesis gained strength for several reasons. Lucas's behavior in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, all that meticulous organization of his affairs, the veiled farewells, the distribution of financial resources, all of this is consistent with someone preparing for a permanent departure. Furthermore, the updating of his will and the sealed letters left for his family are typical actions of people who know they will no longer be present. Psychologists consulted on the case noted that although Lucas did not show signs of traditional clinical depression, there were indications of what they call existential ideation, where the person questions the meaning and purpose of life so deeply that they may reach conclusions that justify, in their mind, the decision to leave. The message about the line between worlds could be Lucas's way of conceptualizing death not as an end, but as a transition, making the decision psychologically more palatable for both him and his loved ones. The promise of reunion would then be not a literal belief, but metaphorical comfort. Investigations focused on this theory led to extensive searches in locations where suicides typically occur. Bridges, cliffs, dense forest areas, deep bodies of water, all were searched. But no trace of Lucas was found. His financial records showed no purchase of means that could be used for suicide. There was no history of online research into methods, something that appears in most cases of planned suicide. And perhaps most significantly, people close to Lucas insist that he was not in despair. He was in an almost opposite state of excited anticipation about something he believed he was about to discover. The second theory proposes that Lucas voluntarily left to begin a new life in some place that had symbolic meaning for him, possibly related to the concept of a line between worlds interpreted geographically. This hypothesis suggests that he may have identified a physical place, perhaps some site with spiritual or esoteric significance, where he believed the barrier between realities was thinner or more permeable. Places like Sedona in Arizona, known for supposed energy vortices, or certain mountains in Tibet considered sacred in Buddhist traditions, or even specific geomagnetic points that some theories claim have unusual properties. Evidence supporting this theory includes the fact that Lucas had a passport, which disappeared along with him. There were also financial transactions in the preceding weeks that could have accumulated sufficient resources for international travel and initial survival in another location. His studies on consciousness and alternative dimensions included research on locations around the world associated with unexplained phenomena or transcendental experiences. And the message about a future encounter could be literal, meaning that he hoped his family would eventually find him at that specific location, or that they would understand where he had gone. However, Searches of immigration databases and border records found no evidence of Lucas leaving the country. Airport and bus station cameras were checked without success. His passport was never used according to official records. And if he planned to live in a remote location indefinitely, significant logistical preparation would have been necessary, which was not detected. Provisions were not purchased, and equipment was not acquired. The theory of a physical departure for a symbolic location, while appealing in its hope that Lucas is still alive somewhere, faces considerable practical obstacles. The third theory, and perhaps the most unsettling, is that Lucas genuinely believed he had discovered a way to access alternative dimensions or realities, and that his message was literal, not metaphorical. In this interpretation, the line between worlds was not a physical place on this plane of reality, but a state of consciousness or method through which he believed he could transition to another dimension of existence. This theory is supported by Lucas's extensive studies of quantum physics, astral projection, altered states of consciousness, and advanced meditative practices. In Lucas's notebooks, investigators found references to experiments he was conducting, attempting to achieve what he called liminal consciousness, a state where he claimed to be able to simultaneously perceive multiple realities. He described sensations of being partially here and partially there, of seeing through the veil that separates worlds. For a scientific mind like his, these were not mystical daydreams, but observations of real phenomena he was experiencing and trying to understand. The mindset of someone who believes they have discovered access to other dimensions is one of scientific excitement mixed with spiritual reverence. This theory would explain why Lucas's body was never found. If we assume that he actually managed, in some way we don't understand, to transition to another state of existence. But obviously, this is the most difficult theory for rationalist minds to accept, because it requires suspension of conventional understanding about the nature of reality. There is no way to prove or disprove it. No way to search for someone in dimensions we cannot access or verify. It is a theory that offers a perfect explanation for all the anomalies of the case, but only if we accept premises that mainstream science does not recognize. There is also a fourth theory, more pragmatic, but no less tragic, that Lucas's message was a code or reference to something specific that only made sense to specific recipients, and that external investigators simply lacked the complete context to understand it. Perhaps Line Between Worlds was the name of a real place that had personal significance for Lucas and his family. Perhaps it was a reference to something from childhood, a shared memory, a place where the family used to go and that represented transition or a boundary in some personal metaphorical sense. Investigators explored this possibility extensively, interviewing family about all the memories they could have with Lucas, all the places they visited together, all the conversations about borders, lines, worlds, dimensions. But no obvious place or memory emerged that perfectly matched. Donna Mariana remembers that when Lucas was a child, they used to go to a beach where there was a rock formation that created a natural line dividing two coves, and he was fascinated by standing exactly on the line where the waters from each side met. Searches were carried out on that beach and adjacent areas, but nothing was found. What all these theories have in common is that none of them fully explains everything. Each one captures some aspect of the case, but leaves others unanswered. And perhaps the reality is that what happened to Lucas was a combination of elements from various theories, a journey that began with existential questioning, evolved through studies on the nature of reality, and culminated in decisions that involved both practical preparation and belief in transcendental possibilities. The impact of this ambiguity on the people who loved him is that they cannot have definitive closure. They cannot fully grieve because that spark of uncertainty about what really happened always remains. Comment below. Truth can be hybrid. If you realize that it might not be one theory or another, but elements of several coexisting in the complex decision Lucas made. Now I want to delve even deeper into the subject, because after analyzing all the theories about what might have happened to Lucas, we need to understand the desperate efforts that were made to find him. And when the only clue you have is an enigmatic phrase about a line between worlds, the search becomes both a traditional police investigation and an almost philosophical journey of trying to understand the mind of someone who saw reality in a fundamentally different way. The behind-the-scenes story of this search reveals as much about human determination as it does about the limitations of what we can do when someone disappears, leaving only words as a map. The official police investigation began immediately when Sophia reported Lucas's disappearance after hearing that disturbing voicemail. The lead investigator, Dr. Roberto Ferreira, had decades of experience in missing persons cases, but admitted he had never encountered anything quite like this. The message about a line between worlds was not a threat suggesting danger from third parties. It was not a cry for help indicating kidnapping. It was not confusion suggesting a compromised medical or mental condition. It was a calm and deliberate declaration of departure for somewhere that could not be located by conventional methods. The first 48 hours focused on standard searches. Hospitals were contacted, medical examiners were checked, accident records were examined. Security cameras in areas near Lucas's apartment were reviewed, showing him leaving home alone at 2:15 a.m., walking calmly down the street with a small backpack, and then simply leaving the camera's range and never being seen again. There were no signs of him meeting anyone, no vehicle picking him up, no indication of where he went after leaving the last camera's field of vision. But as it became clear that Lucas had meticulously planned his disappearance, the investigation shifted its approach. Dr. Ferreira brought in experts in linguistics, psychology, and even philosophy to analyze a message and try to determine if line between worlds could refer to a real physical location. All locations that had any connection to Lucas's life were systematically checked. The childhood beach that Dona Mariana mentioned, the park where he used to run, places he had designed as an architect, even the property where his family had briefly lived when he was a teenager. Teams were sent to each one, but they found nothing. The transformation in the search occurred when investigators began to seriously consider the possibility that Lucas had gone to some place with esoteric or spiritual significance. Based on the books he had read and the websites he had visited, they compiled a list of places around the world known in spiritual circles as having special properties, such as being points where veils are thinner or where multiple dimensions supposedly meet. This list included places like Stonehenge in England, Mount Shasta in California, Machu Picchu in Peru, certain regions of Tibet, and even specific geological formations in Brazil like the Chapada dos Veadeiros. Alerts were sent to authorities in all these regions. Photos of Lucas were shared, and requests were made to be on the lookout for anyone matching his description. But months passed without any confirmed sightings. If Lucas had gone to any of these places, he had managed to remain completely invisible, which in an era of ubiquitous surveillance and omnipresent social media is extraordinarily difficult to achieve. Alongside the official investigation, the family conducted their own search. Sophia, in particular, became obsessed with trying to decipher every nuance of the message her brother left. She constantly revisited the voicemail, listening not only to the words but also to the tone, the pauses, any background detail that might contain an additional clue. There's a moment in the recording, about 20 seconds before Lucas starts speaking, where you can hear wind, and Sophia spent hours trying to identify whether it was urban wind between buildings or open wind from a field or beach. She even consulted forensic audio experts, but they couldn't determine the location based solely on that sound. Dona Mariana adopted a different but equally desperate approach. She began attending spiritual groups and communities that Lucas had shown interest in. Try to understand from the inside what could have captured her son's attention so completely. She participated in meditation sessions, lectures on expanded consciousness, and workshops on shamanic practices. Not because she necessarily believed in these things, but because she wanted to get into Lucas's mindset, to see the world as he saw it, hoping that this would reveal where he might have gone. In one of these groups, she met someone who said they had practiced techniques similar to those Lucas was studying, and this person mentioned that advanced practitioners sometimes seek total isolation in caves or mountains to reach transcendental states. This information led to a new wave of searches. Speleologists were consulted about caves in a region that would be suitable for prolonged isolation. Mountaineers were asked about remote, hard-to-reach locations where someone could establish temporary or permanent camp. Some of these searches were coordinated by the police. Others were expeditions organized by friends and volunteers who were moved by the case. Every weekend for months, groups set out for remote areas with photos of Lucas, hiking trails, exploring caves, calling his name in valleys that echoed back only silence. Raphael, the friend who had that significant conversation with Lucas days before his disappearance, developed his own theory. He believed that line between worlds could refer to the literal border between countries or states, places where you are technically in two places at the same time. He researched all accessible border points from the city where Lucas lived. He personally visited several of these borders, especially those in remote areas, asking locals if they had seen anyone matching Lucas's description. On one of these trips, a farmer said he had seen a man who could be Lucas weeks after the disappearance, walking alone toward the mountains. But when Raphael investigated further, the description didn't quite match and the trail went cold. The emotional impact of this endless search on those involved was devastating. Every clue that led nowhere, every theory that proved fruitless, every search that ended empty-handed, all of this accumulated layers of frustration and hopelessness. But at the same time, stopping the search seemed unacceptable. It seemed like giving up on Lucas. It seemed like accepting that he was lost forever. So they continued, even when they rationally knew that the chances of finding him diminished with each passing day. There were moments of renewed hope that always ended in disappointment. Someone would report seeing Lucas in another city, and the family would rush there only to discover it was a misidentification. A psychic would offer to use psychic abilities to locate Lucas, describing specific places where he might be, and searches would be organized in those areas without success. Social media posts about missing persons would bring dozens of comments from users claiming to have information, but when investigated, they would turn out to be unfounded speculation or even deliberate cruelty from trolls. This search journey also revealed something profound about how we deal with ambiguous loss. That type of loss where there's no body, no confirmation of death, no definitive closure. It's an emotional limbo where you can't fully grieve because there's still a possibility that the person is alive somewhere. And at the same time, you can't live normally because their absence dominates everything. Donna Mariana described how it was impossible to organize a funeral or memorial ceremony because it seemed premature, as if doing so would be declaring Lucas dead when he might simply be somewhere deciding not to make contact. The police kept the case open far beyond the usual time because the family kept bringing new theories, new possible interpretations of the message, new places to search. Dr. Ferreira admitted in an interview that the case haunted him, that he constantly thought about the message, "We will meet on a line between worlds," trying to see something that everyone else had missed, some angle that could finally reveal where Lucas went. But as years passed without any concrete clues, without any sign of life, the harsh reality began to set in. If Lucas didn't want to be found, if he had planned this with the care and determination he evidently applied, then perhaps it simply wasn't possible to find him through conventional methods. Write this down. Searching is also about hoping. If you understand that continuing the search was as much about finding Lucas as it was about not accepting the loss. Now I want to delve even deeper into the subject, because as the search for Lucas dragged on without results, investigators began to ask the crucial question: was this a unique case, or were there other disappearances with similar characteristics? And when you start looking for patterns in cases of people who disappeared leaving enigmatic messages about lines, borders, veils, and parallel worlds, what emerges is both fascinating and deeply unsettling, because it suggests that there may be a broader phenomenon happening. People around the world reaching similar conclusions about the nature of reality and making similar decisions based on those conclusions. Dr. Ferreira, the detective in charge of Lucas's case, began searching national and international databases of missing persons using specific keywords: line, border, veil, worlds, dimensions, transition. What he found surprised him. There were at least 17 documented cases in the last 20 years in different countries where people had disappeared leaving messages with surprisingly similar language. They weren't identical phrases, but they shared themes and concepts that were impossible to dismiss as mere coincidence. One of the oldest cases he encountered dated back to 2001 in Portugal. A 42-year-old physics professor named Helena Rodriguez disappeared after leaving an email for her husband saying, "I found the passage between planes. Don't look for me here. Look at the intersection where realities meet. I love you beyond dimensions." Like Lucas, Helena had shown a growing interest in quantum physics and mystical interpretations of quantum mechanics. She was never found, and her case remains officially unsolved to this day. In 2006 in Canada, a 30-year-old software engineer named Michael Chin disappeared, leaving behind a series of posts on his personal blog in the preceding weeks. The last post, published hours before he vanished, read, "The border is thinner than we think. Tomorrow I will consciously cross it. We will see each other on the other side, where the code of reality is visible. Michael had developed an obsessive interest in simulation theory, the idea that our reality is computationally simulated, and apparently believed he had found a way to hack out of the simulation. Extensive searches did not reveal his whereabouts. In 2012, a 28-year-old Italian artist named Francesca Moretti disappeared after creating an entire art installation dedicated to what she called dimensional liminality. Her last work was a series of paintings showing human figures existing simultaneously on multiple planes of reality, with thin lines separating the planes. She left a note in her studio. Art was only preparation. Now I'm going where the paintings pointed. We will meet on the edge where worlds touch. She was never found. The pattern that emerges from these cases and several other similar ones is disturbing in its consistency. Most of the people were intelligent, functional, with no history of serious mental illness. Many had an interest in theoretical physics, philosophy, spirituality, or combinations of these fields. All went through periods of months where they became increasingly absorbed in questions about the nature of reality and the possibility of the existence of alternative dimensions or planes. And all eventually disappeared, leaving messages that spoke of crossing borders, finding passages, traversing veils, or reuniting at lines between worlds. Dr. Amanda Silva, a psychologist specializing in missing persons cases who was consulted, developed a theory about what might connect all these cases. She proposes that there is a certain type of personality, which she calls a liminal seeker, that is particularly susceptible to developing beliefs about the accessibility of other realities. These are intellectually curious people, often with backgrounds in science or the arts, who are not satisfied with conventional explanations about the nature of existence. They actively seek deeper meaning, hidden truths, and ways to transcend the limitations of what we perceive as ordinary reality. According to Dr. Silva, the transformation these people undergo follows a relatively consistent pattern. It begins with legitimate philosophical questioning about the nature of consciousness and reality. It evolves into intensive study of multiple disciplines in an attempt to find answers. Then come subjective experiences during meditation or other altered states that the person interprets as glimpses of other dimensions or realities. And finally, an absolute conviction develops that not only do other realities exist, but that they are accessible through specific methods that the person believes they have discovered. Once this conviction solidifies, the decision to cross over becomes not a question of if, but of when. What is particularly unsettling is that in none of these cases were the missing persons found. They were not located living under new identities in other countries. They were not found dead in ways that confirmed suicide. They simply vanished without leaving any physical trace beyond their cryptic messages. This raises disturbing questions. Is it possible that all these people committed suicide in such remote locations or by such effective methods that the bodies would never be found? Or is there something else going on that we don't understand? Experts in anomalous phenomena were consulted, including researchers who study out-of-body experiences, astral projection, and claims of interdimensional travel. Dr. Ricardo Almeida, who has studied for decades accounts of people claiming to have had experiences in other dimensions, notes that there's a long history of individuals who disappeared under mysterious circumstances after claiming to have accessed alternative realities. He is careful not to make claims about what actually happened to these people, but points out that the phenomenon is sufficiently consistent and documented across centuries and cultures to merit serious study rather than automatic dismissal. There are also historical cases that seem to fit the pattern. In 1894, a British physicist named James Warson disappeared while jogging on a rural road, supposedly seen by two witnesses simply vanishing mid-stride. Although details of this case are disputed and may be apocryphal, they reflect a recurring narrative of people who seem to literally disappear from the physical plane without a trace. In 1923, a French explorer studying shamanic practices in Tibet wrote in her last diary, "Tomorrow, the lamas will show me the passage. If I do not return, know that I have found what I was looking for." She was never seen again. The impact of discovering all these parallel cases in Lucas's investigation was twofold. On the one hand, it offered some comfort to know that he wasn't alone, that there were other brilliant minds who had reached similar conclusions and taken similar paths. On the other hand, the fact that none of these cases had been solved, that no one had returned or been found, made the prospect of locating Lucas even bleaker. If there was a historical precedent for people disappearing in this way and never being found, what hope was there? Sophia became obsessed with these other cases. She contacted families of other missing people who left similar messages, forming an informal support network of people united by the shared experience of losing someone to what they began to call the liminal phenomenon. These families exchanged theories, shared search strategies, and offered emotional support. But they also shared the same fundamental frustration. No matter how much they researched, how much they searched, their loved ones remained missing. The messages about lines and borders remained undecipherable in terms of physical location. There was heated debate among researchers about whether these cases should be categorized together as a specific phenomenon or whether they were merely superficial coincidences of similar language being used in completely different contexts. Skeptics argue that when you look for patterns, you eventually find them, even if there is no real connection. That people using metaphorical language about borders and worlds doesn't mean they are all heading for the same destination or for the same reasons. But those who studied the cases closely noted that similarities went beyond just language, including psychological profiles, trajectories of belief change, and meticulous preparations that all followed surprisingly similar scripts. The journey through these parallel cases also revealed something about our collective mindset as a species. There is something deep and persistent in the human psyche that refuses to accept that this perceived reality is all that exists. Across all cultures and eras, humans have created concepts of other worlds, other planes, other dimensions. And some individuals, apparently, take these concepts so seriously that they act on them in radical ways. Whether this is a sign of deep intuition about truths that science has not yet reached, or whether it is a manifestation of a psychological need to believe in more than what is measurable, remains an open question. Comment below. This is not an isolated case. If you perceive that there is something bigger happening here that defies simple explanations. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because we've reached a point where you probably want to know. What happened to Lucas? Was he found? Was the message finally deciphered? And the answer, as frustrating as it is honest, is that 2.5 years have passed since that early morning when he left his apartment with a small backpack and disappeared. And to this day, Lucas Andrade has not been located. There is no body, no confirmation of death, no evidence of new life elsewhere. There's only silence, the kind of silence that is louder than any answer could be. The case remains officially open, but the reality is that it's essentially cold. The police have no more active leads to follow. No new evidence is emerging. No witnesses are coming forward with information after all this time. Dr. Ferreira, who has dedicated countless hours to trying to solve this case, admits in interviews that without a significant twist, without Lucas deciding to make contact, or without someone accidentally stumbling upon evidence of his whereabouts, the chances of resolution are minimal. And this perpetual uncertainty, this lack of closure, is in many ways harder to bear than any definitive truth, however painful it might be. There were a few moments throughout those 2.5 years where it seemed like something might develop. Approximately 6 months after his disappearance, a backpacker on a remote mountain trail, about 200 kilometers from the city, where Lucas lived, found a partially burned notebook hidden among rocks. The notebook contained notes on consciousness, dimensions, and drawings of complex geometric symbols. The handwriting had similarities to Lucas's, but graphology experts could not confirm it with absolute certainty. Furthermore, there was no definitive identification, no name, no clear reference that specifically connected that notebook to Lucas. It could have been his, or it could have been someone else's on a similar spiritual journey. A year after his disappearance, on Lucas's exact birthday, Sophia received a letter in the mail. It had no return address, and the postmark was from a distant coastal town. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten sentence. The line remains. The encounter is inevitable, not in your search, but in your natural journey. The handwriting was strikingly similar to Lucas's, but again, experts couldn't confirm it with absolute certainty. It could be him signaling that he was alive somewhere, or it could be someone cruel playing with the emotions of a desperate family. The police tried to trace the letter's origin, but the paper was ordinary, the ink was generic, and the postmark came from an agency that processed thousands of letters daily without a specific record of who posted what. These events offered brief moments of renewed hope, but were always followed by silence again. And as time passed, the family had to begin making difficult choices about how to live with Lucas's absence. After 2 years, Donna Mariana finally allowed friends to organize a memorial ceremony, not as a funeral, because she refused to accept that Lucas was dead, but as a way to celebrate his life and create space for the community to process the loss collectively. During the ceremony, she read aloud excerpts from the letters Lucas had left for her, sharing with everyone the profound love he had expressed and the absolute conviction he had about the path he was taking. Sophia made a different but equally significant decision. She moved to the coastal town from where that mysterious letter had been mailed, not because she was sure Lucas was there, but because she needed to feel she was doing something, that she was getting closer to the possibility of finding him. She got a job at a local art gallery, and on weekends, she walks along the beaches and trails of the region, always with a photo of Lucas on her cell phone, always stopping to ask locals if they've seen him. Most shake their heads, but she keeps asking, because stopping feels like giving up. The transformation that Lucas's disappearance brought to the people who loved him is profound and permanent. Raphael, his friend, developed an almost academic interest in philosophy of mind and the nature of reality, as if by studying the same things Lucas studied, he could eventually understand what led his friend to make the decision he made. He maintains a blog where he writes about his intellectual explorations, and sometimes adds posts addressed directly to Lucas, in case he is somewhere with internet access, and decides to discreetly monitor the lives of the people he left behind. Donna Mariana never removed the phrase Lucas had written on his bedroom wall. "We will meet on the line between worlds," remains there, along with all those enigmatic numbers and symbols that no one has been able to fully decipher. She says that keeping the words there is a way to honor his conviction, even if she doesn't fully understand it. It's also a constant reminder that her son made decisions based on deep beliefs, and that respecting those beliefs is part of loving him, even when they hurt more than words can express. The lasting impact of the specific message Lucas left is particularly complex, because it wasn't a simple farewell, it was a promise. And promises create expectations. They create hopes that need to be carried indefinitely. The phrase, "we will meet again," implies a future. It implies reunion. It implies that the separation is temporary. And for grieving people, this kind of hope can be both a blessing and a curse. It's comforting to believe they will see their loved one again, even if only metaphorically through memories or spiritually after their own deaths. But it also makes complete closure impossible, because there's always that whispering voice that perhaps, just perhaps, the promise is more literal than metaphorical. There were minor revelations over time that added context without necessarily solving the central mystery. Investigators discovered that Lucas had been in online contact with some of the families of other missing persons who had left similar messages. He had exchanged emails with the sister of Michael Chun, the Canadian software engineer, discussing theories about the nature of reality. He had participated in an online forum where relatives of Helena Rodriguez, the Portuguese teacher, shared her last words and tried to interpret their meaning. This suggests that Lucas was aware that there were others who had followed similar paths, and that perhaps this reinforced his conviction that what he planned to do was not only possible, but had already been done by others before him. This discovery was both enlightening and disturbing, because it means that Lucas had role models, had precedents, had a kind of invisible community of people who shared his beliefs about the accessibility of other realities. And knowing that others had disappeared leaving similar messages may have been, for him, validation that he was on the right track. If multiple people independently arrive at the same conclusions and take the same actions, there is natural human logic that interprets this as evidence that those conclusions and actions are correct. But, of course, from the outside, for those who remain, it looks more like multiple tragedies following the same painful script. The current situation is that the family lives in a bifurcated reality. Part of them is accepted, as far as possible, that Lucas will probably not return, that whatever his fate, it was deliberately chosen and executed in a way that made his return or discovery improbable. But another part of them, that part of the human heart that refuses to give up on those it loves, maintains constant vigilance, always attentive to any sign, any possibility, any small chance that Lucas might be out there somewhere, waiting for the right moment to make contact or for them to finally understand a message and find the line between the worlds where he promised they would meet? Comment below. Living without knowing is torture. If you understand that the absence of answers can be more difficult than any definitive truth. Now I want to delve even deeper into the subject, because after going through this entire journey, from that enigmatic message to the endless search that followed, we need to stop and reflect on what Luke's story teaches us. Not just about him specifically, but about all of us, about how we live, about how we communicate, and about what really matters when we face the inevitable truth that our existence here is temporary and fragile. Let's recap the main elements of the story because they form a pattern that deserves to be understood. Lucas was an ordinary man, intelligent, functional, loved by family and friends. Over the course of months, he underwent a profound intellectual and spiritual transformation, exploring questions about the nature of reality and arriving at conclusions that led him to believe in the accessibility of other dimensions or planes of existence. He meticulously planned his disappearance, organizing his affairs, making veiled farewells, and finally leaving specific messages saying, "We will meet on a line between worlds," before simply disappearing. 2.5 years later, he has not been found, and his family lives in the torment of not knowing if he is alive, dead, if he achieved what he sought, or if he is somewhere repentant but unable to return. The impact of cryptic messages on the grieving process is something that deserves serious reflection. Because when someone dies and leaves clear farewells, however painful it may be, there's a kind of closure that allows the grieving process to follow its natural course. You know what happened. You can begin to accept it. You can eventually begin to heal. But when the last words are an enigma, when they are promises of reunion in undefined places, when they are statements about alternative realities, grief is suspended in a state of limbo. You can't completely let go because there's always that doubt. What if the message is literal? What if there really is a way to meet them again if you just decipher the code, find the right place, understand what they were trying to say? This ambiguity prolongs suffering in specific and particular ways. Donna Mariana cannot properly grieve for Lucas because she doesn't know if he is dead. Sophia cannot fully move on with her life because there is always that voice saying that perhaps her brother needs her. Perhaps he is waiting for her to understand the message and come to find him. Friends are trapped between memory and hope, never knowing whether they should celebrate Lucas's life in the past or continue to mentally include him as a presence that may return in the future. The mindset behind the last words we choose to say is something few of us deeply consider until it's too late. Lucas, because he meticulously planned everything, had the rare opportunity to choose his final messages precisely, and he chose words that reflected his deepest beliefs, his hopes for what he was about to experience, his attempt to offer comfort through the promise of reunion. But in retrospect, those words, however much they came from a place of love, created a different kind of pain for those left behind. And this raises an important question. If we knew we were about to leave someone's life permanently, what would we choose to say? Most of us would probably say simple, direct things. I love you. Thank you for everything. Be happy. Don't grieve for me. Words that offer closure, that allow the person to move on with good memories, but without the weight of unsolved enigmas. But Lucas, operating with a belief system that diverged from the conventional one, chose words that reflected his personal truth, even knowing that they might not be fully understood by others. And there is something both beautiful and tragic in this absolute authenticity, even in the last communications. The importance of clear communication with close people cannot be underestimated. And here I'm not just talking about final words, but about continuous communication throughout life. If Lucas had shared more openly with family and friends the intellectual and spiritual journey he was undertaking, if he had expressed his doubts, his discoveries, his emerging beliefs more transparently, perhaps they could have had conversations that would have grounded him or at least allowed him to better understand his final decisions. But like many of us, Lucas kept his deepest explorations private, perhaps out of fear of judgment, perhaps because he knew they wouldn't be understood, perhaps because the journey was so personal that it couldn't be contained in shareable words. And this leads us to profound philosophical questions that Lucas's case inevitably raises. Where's the line between worlds for each of us? For Lucas, it was apparently something he believed he could literally cross through specific practices and at a chosen moment. But for most of us, The line between worlds can mean completely different things. It could be the boundary we cross when we die, whatever that means in terms of the continuity of consciousness. It could be the barriers we place between our public and private lives, between who we show the world and who we really are. It could be the threshold we face in moments of profound transformation, those points of no return, where we make decisions that fundamentally change who we are. Or perhaps the line between worlds is something more metaphorical and universal. The space between being truly present with someone and merely being physically beside them. The people we love exist in their own inner world, their own subjective realities that we can never fully access. And every communication, every moment of genuine connection, is an attempt to cross that line, to touch another person's inner world with our own. When that communication stops, when someone disappears or dies, we remain on our side of the line, unable to cross, calling out to a world we can no longer reach. The reflection on mortality that this case provokes is inevitable and necessary. Lucas was 33 years old, young by today's standards, with decades of potential life still ahead of him. But he made the choice, based on his beliefs, to leave when and how he left. And this forces us to confront the truth that none of us knows how much time we have. We don't need to believe in alternative dimensions to recognize that life is temporary, that the people we love will not always be available, that there's a real urgency to express love, gratitude, and presence while we still have the opportunity. The meaning we seek in life, the quest that led Lucas down such extraordinary paths, is universal. We all want to feel that our existence matters, that there's more than just a daily routine of working, eating, sleeping, repeating until we die. And there are infinite ways to seek this meaning. Some find it in relationships, in family, in creating and nurturing other lives. Others find it in creative work, in contributing something unique to the world. Some find it in service to others, in alleviating suffering, in making a difference in their communities. And some, like Lucas, seek it in intellectual and spiritual explorations of the fundamental nature of reality. None of these pursuits is inherently superior to the others, but some are safer, more compatible with continuing to live and maintaining connections with people who love us. Lucas's journey took him beyond those connections, to a place where his personal beliefs became more important than remaining in the world shared with those who loved him. And there's a tragedy in that, because even if he found what he was looking for, even if he is somewhere at peace with his decisions, the people he left behind live with the ongoing pain of his absence. Ultimately, human connection may be what matters most. Not the cosmic truths we discover, not the mysteries we unravel, but the simple moments of being truly present with another person, of being seen and known, of seeing and knowing someone in return. Lucas had those connections. He had people who loved him deeply, and his departure left holes in those lives that will never be completely filled, regardless of how many cosmic meanings he discovered in his solitary explorations. Comment below. Connection is everything. If you realize that perhaps the greatest meaning we can find lies in the simple and authentic human relationships we cultivate, if you've made it this far, to this final moment with me, it's because you understand that stories like Lucas's aren't just about unsolved mysteries. They're about all of us, about the choices we make, about the words we leave behind, about how we search for meaning in a universe that doesn't always offer clear answers. And that means more than you can imagine. If this type of content resonates with you, if you value investigations that explore not only what happened but why, and what that reveals about our deepest human nature, subscribe to the channel. Because here we delve into cases that make you think about your own life, your own connections, and what really matters. You are part of this community of people who are not afraid to ask the tough questions. Leave a comment now saying, "I found the line." These 3 words show that you've journeyed with me, that you reflected on profound themes we've explored, that you're taking something valuable from this story. And knowing that you've been there from beginning to end is what makes this work meaningful. If Lucas's story touched you in any way, if you felt that connection with the questions about meaning, mortality, and the messages we leave behind, leave a like. It's your way of saying that content like this, which deals with real mysteries with the depth and respect they deserve, is worth existing and reaching more people. And look, there's a video over here about another case where someone's last words carried meanings that were only understood too late. If you want to continue exploring how cryptic messages reveal truths about who we are, click and stay with me there. There's much more to discover together. Thank you for being here, for investing this time, for being part of this reflection. We'll meet again in the next mystery.